Our next speaker is Mr. Paul Kimball, and he's won multiple awards and scholarships at university level and graduated from Acadia in 1989 with an honors degree in history and political science. In 1992 from Dalhousie with an LLB. I get that that's equivalent of a JD or
it's a
law degree. A former program administrator at Nova Scotia Film Development Corporation and a consultant to Salter Street Films. Paul co-founded Redstar Films Limited in 1999. His work as a producer and director since for networks including Bravo, CBC, Space, Vision TV, and SCN includes documentaries Stanton T. Friedman is Real, Denise DeJoac, 7 Days and 7 Nights, Notes from the Underground, A Night at the Opera, Do You Believe in Magic, and Aztec 1948, as well as first 2 seasons of a critically acclaimed television series called Classical Now. Paul is a member of the Nova Scotia Bannisters Society and Society of Composers and Authors and Publishers, Nova Scotia Film Festival and Television Producers Association, where he currently serves as president. So we have a president of a film association here. Paul resides in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, another Canadian here today, and his talk will be about Aztec 1948, a documentary reappraisal of the first flying saucer story. Please help me welcome Mr. Paul Kimball.
That's a typo. It's the Nova Scotia Barristers Society. Not sure what a banister is, other than something to slide down when I'm drunk. But the Barristers Society, we're the lawyers. Now I haven't practiced law in an awful long time, but I do remember that I was once in front of a Supreme Court judge in Nova Scotia, and I was making my closing argument, and the judge, probably the only time in the history of Nova Scotia courts this has happened, said, "Mr. Kimball, sit down and shut up." He had a tea time, and I had already made my case. So I won the case, and he shot in '84. My dad always told me, too, that brevity is the source of wit. I have 30 minutes, so I will be very witty. I'm going to try and make the case to you today, not that the Aztec incident was a crashed flying saucer, because I don't think that case can be made yet, but that the Aztec incident needs to be reconsidered after almost 50 years of being largely ignored by mainstream ufology and written off as a hoax. And through the work of a researcher from North Carolina named Scott Ramsey and others, evidence has come to light that I think requires us all to re-examine what was the first crashed flying saucer story to be made public, not including Jim Mars's 1897 account in Aurora in the Dallas newspapers, but the first one to receive widespread publicity in a book in 1950, long before Roswell became popular, called Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully. Where'd that come from? Now, these are the key points. I'll go through the Aztec story timeline very quickly in case some of you don't know the main story, and then I'll talk about 3 key things. Frank Scully himself, his book, J.P. Kahn, who was an investigative reporter who first exposed 2 of Scully's key sources as con men, and I'll get into a bit more about that. Also, the secret radar bases. The witnesses, and there are more than this, but these are the 3 that I will highlight: Doug Nolan, Ken Farley, who you probably don't know or haven't heard of, and Robert Sarbacher, who I suspect most of you have heard of. So I'll touch on him briefly. And then I have a secret surprise. They've been interviewing. Scott's tracked down, you'll see, 2 police officers that were allegedly at the crash site. That's always been somewhat controversial. Scott has tracked down, they're dead now, but he's tracked down relatives of those police officers, and we have some new information, and I will reveal the identity of one of those police officers to you. Maybe. And then something I like to call the conclusion. This is the Aztec timeline, the major points. In March 1948, a flying saucer allegedly crashed near Aztec, New Mexico. They always call it the Roswell incident or the Aztec incident, as if these saucers crashed in downtown Roswell or downtown Aztec. In fact, while nobody's quite sure where the Roswell saucer crashed, there's 4 or 5 different sites. I always take Stan Friedman's. In Aztec, they pretty much narrowed it down to a mesa that's about 15 miles or 20 miles outside of town. In 1950, Frank Scully, a journalist and author and a war veteran, which I think is important and we'll see why, publishes Behind the Flying Saucers. The book deals with the UFO phenomenon in general and the Aztec incident in particular. And the key witnesses to Aztec are a guy named Silas Newton, who I won't talk so much about, but who was definitely a con man, and Dr. G, an anonymous source, and his colleague Dr. Wiz. That was in the draft that never made it to publication. In 1952, so Behind the Flying Saucers became a best-selling book, multiple printings, and this was big, thousands upon thousands of copies sold back in the days when you could actually sell thousands upon thousands of copies of a UFO book. In 1952, though, True magazine published an article by J.P. Kahn, who was an investigative reporter from San Francisco, detailing fraudulent activities of the aforementioned Silas Newton and a guy named Leo Gebauer, and claiming that Gebauer was Scully's mysterious witness, Dr. G. Scully and Gebauer denied that Gebauer was G, and Scully continued to defend the Aztec story. However, in 1953, Newton and Gebauer were convicted of fraud in a Denver, Colorado court. The Aztec story was discredited. It doesn't help when a couple of your key sources are convicted of fraud, and forgotten by mainstream ufology. I'd even say buried. In 1964, Frank Scully dies, still convinced that the Aztec story is real and maintaining that the story was real. In 1987, a book called, and you'll note there's not much happening for the next 23 years. In 1987, a book called The Aztec UFO Crash by Wendell Stevens and Bill Steinman was published privately, but to little impact in mainstream ufology. It kind of came and went, and it was a very problematic book. William Steinman is a problematic guy, but there were some interesting leads in that book that couldn't be ignored, particularly by Scott Ramsey, who began his research into Aztec in 1989. In 1998, Aztec, the town, held its first annual UFO symposium as the story started to come to light again. A number of the people that you see here at this conference, including Nick Redfern, Stan Friedman, and others, John Greenwald's wandering around, have all spoke at Aztec. It's a nice symposium. And in 2004, the turning point, I think, really, in the whole thing, is I made my documentary that re-examines the Aztec incident and released by my company. I was just kidding when I said the turning point. Although maybe it will be. There's the book that started it all, Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully. I'm not sure if that's what a flying saucer looks like, but... And there's Frank. I've come to feel like I know him, so I call him Frank. In 1955, after the trial and the True Magazine articles and everything, and Scully's name had been dragged through the mud, and he was naive, and he'd been duped by these two guys, Newton and Gebauer, here's what he's still saying. I state categorically that I not only never admitted that Behind the Flying Saucers was a hoax, and there were people who were saying, well, Scully actually admitted it, but moreover have never read anything by anybody that proved it was a hoax. Calling and proving, as the ufologists in this room should know, are not the same thing. There's Frank with his wife, who I don't know so well, so I don't know her name. Now this is interesting to me, and I think it goes to say something about Frank Scully's character. For years and years, people have just put down the entire Aztec story and said, hoax, Scully was an idiot, he was duped, he believed what he wanted to believe, as Karl Pflock might say. I admire the candor of people who are willing to say, you know what, not everything that I was told was factual. I looked at it with a critical mind. Some of it might have been and some of it might not. This is what impressed me about Scully. Again, in 1955, after two of his key sources had been largely discredited, the book was in disgrace, if a book could be in disgrace. This is what he said. That my book is full of error, I would be the first to point out, and he was. But these are correctable errors, and many are due to the fact that under pressure from my publisher, I had to write it in 72 days. Our group has done vast amounts of research since Behind the Flying Saucers was published. Some of it had substance, some of it petered out, and some of it was founded on hoaxes. So he's not denying that there was an element of misdirection going on out in the West in the 1950s, but he's also saying, look, you can't write the entire thing off just because maybe a couple of guys were doing cons. There's more evidence and information here than just that. And then he says, but is any lawyer worth his salt, which I am not, which is why I don't practice anymore, but still, can read the book and will tell you the strangest part of this story is that nobody can ever prove it didn't happen. But I am not satisfied with this, and we should never be satisfied with just saying, well, you can't prove it didn't happen, which is silly. What kind of standard of proof is that? I want to prove, he said, or I want some other serious scholars to prove that it did happen. I respect that. He wouldn't have cared, maybe. Now, about Dr. Leo, because there weren't very many pictures extant of any of these people, we had an artist come in for our film and draw some cool pictures. That's Frank Scully on the left, Leo Gebauer looking nervous in the middle, and Silas Newton suitably shaded in dark colors in a film noir way on the right. Frank Scully wrote in 1955, if anyone can find anywhere that I name a Leo Gebauer in Behind the Flying Saucers as Dr. G, he can have the royalties to my next 5 books. Now, put up or shut up. Fair enough. Stan Friedman did that with Phil Klass once, and Stan won $1,000, which is cool. I like people who have the guts to go out and say, if you can prove it, if it's there, I'll pay up. They never did because he doesn't mention Leo Gebauer as Dr. G in his book. In fact, both Frank Scully and Leo Gebauer denied until their deaths that Leo Gebauer was Dr. G. The interesting thing is, who said Leo Gebauer was Dr. G? Did anybody ever admit to it? You'd think, okay, that's important. It traces back to the 1952 article in True Magazine by J.P. Kahn. Kahn tried his best. Sounds like a Star Trek movie. Kahn tried his best to get Scully to admit that Leo Gebauer was Dr. G. Wouldn't do it. So he went and he tried to get Leo Gebauer to admit that he was Dr. G. Wouldn't do it. So J.P. Kahn went ahead anyway in his article and said, Leo Gebauer is Dr. G. Why? Because I think he is. And because there's some circumstantial evidence, perhaps, maybe, that indicates he could be if everybody else on the planet Earth was dead. Now, I'm sorry, I'm being a little facetious. It wasn't quite that bad. But there was no evidence presented in Kahn's article that said Gebauer was Dr. G. But he said it. And ever since, if you read the papers that were written by people like Bill Moore and Karl Pflock, they routinely say, well, of course, Scully's source, Dr. G, was Leo Gebauer. Where do they trace that back to? The True Magazine article. If you read the True Magazine article, which I have, it's never mentioned in there that he has definitive proof. That's us. That's Scott. That's my sound guy on the left. He's a cool guy, by the way. And there's Scott Ramsey getting a microphone put on him. And that's me looking out wondering, are there really mountain lions in northern New Mexico? And is your gun loaded, Scott? Oh, sorry. I've moved on to the secret radar bases. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. That was very quick about Leo Gebauer. But the important point I'd like to make about Gebauer, and we'll just go back here very quickly to, oops, too far, to our friend Leo, is there's no evidence that he was Dr. G. He may well have been. But to state it as a fact and to base your entire rejection of the Aztec story on that one fact, I think is a mistake. Now, here's another interesting thing, and if you track down Nick Redfern, my good friend Nick, later on, he'll tell you more about it. But Gebauer, this con man, this simple con man, as the debunkers would have us believe, had a 400-page FBI file. 400 pages. I bet Stan doesn't have a 400-page FBI file, although we don't know. The interesting thing about Gebauer is I'd like to call him as a witness, and because he's dead, I would read from the transcript, his FBI file. Unfortunately, I can only read the boring bits, those 200 pages that the government has declassified. The other 200 pages of this simple con man, 50 years later, are still classified for reasons of national security. Now, I'm not a conspiracy freak, but even a dumb Nova Scotian boy like myself knows that 50 years later, when 200 pages of your FBI file are still classified for national security, you might be something more than just a simple con man. I'm just, sort of spitballing there. It's funny how as you get older, spitballing's good, but in grade 5, not good. This is us, anyway. That's a handsome guy on the right. Secret radar bases. Now, the interesting thing is, once you've sort of called into question the whole hoax thing, was it just a hoax? Couldn't we move beyond that? It's important to look at other evidence. Look at Scully's book. Look at what Scully was saying in the 1950s, when he would give speeches or other writings, and see if you can find things in the book or in his other writings and speeches that could not be verified then unless you knew something on the inside, but that we can verify now. Well, what happened is Scott Ramsey went out and he said, well, look, there's this thing about secret radar bases. Scully mentioned secret radar bases. And he says his source, Dr. G, who Scully said were 8 scientists. It's a composite he used to protect the identity of his 8 scientists. Now, as Stan Friedman will say, I've heard Stan a lot, so I quote him, you know, we don't know who Deep Throat is, but that doesn't mean what he said was incorrect. Journalists often use, as we all know, cover names to protect their sources. So that's what Scully always said. Dr. G was a cover name to protect these 8 scientists. Anyway, one of the things that apparently the 8 scientists told him were there were these secret radar bases in northern New Mexico to protect Los Alamos and Sandia and Kirtland Air Force Base. Well, for years the debunkers said, of course not. There's no secret radar bases up there. Hooey. Well, Scott went looking for the secret radar bases, thinking if I can find them, then that means maybe Scully knew something that he only could have known if somebody on the inside had told him. Well, guess what? Scott found them. All you had to do was a little research. They're there. They're at Alvarado in northern New Mexico, not too far from Dulce. One in Continental Divide, and one in Moriarty, all in New Mexico. But Scott had a problem. The bases, according to the Air Force, weren't active until 1950. The Aztec incident happened in 1948. That's a problem. But Scott read the reports. It's always important to actually read the reports. And in the reports, it said, well, in 1950, here's the Air Force coming in with these brand new bases, and they're talking about replacing all the equipment in them. Well, now, we Canadians like to make fun of you good folks down here about overspending on your military. But when you build bases, not even we believe that they would put in lousy equipment that would have to be replaced immediately, all of it. Scott was curious. It turns out the bases were created in 1946, but not by the Air Force, by the Atomic Energy Commission, who then turned the bases over to the Air Force in 1950. If you only read the Air Force reports, you go, well, of course, there were no bases in 1948. But if you do a little more research, which the debunkers don't often do, you'd find out the bases did exist in 1948. And if you didn't believe they were top secret, take a look. It's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, no disrespect to the folks of northern New Mexico. It's lovely country, but it's nowhere. If you didn't know it was there, Scott didn't say, oh, look, see that little road up there? It leads to a secret radar base. You wouldn't know it. The people at the time, you know, if you look, people always say, too, I hear this at every conference I go to, debunkers and even some skeptics I talk to, well, surely somebody must have known. Surely somebody must have seen them carting the crash wreckage out of Aztec, or surely somebody near the Alvarado radar base must have known it was there. Probably. They probably did see the alien wreckage, and they probably thought, hey, look, a couple of trucks on a deserted highway. Hey, look, it's a base. We don't know what's going on there, but it's a base. But that doesn't mean that you know, these things weren't secret and that they couldn't be kept secret. There are cougars there, by the way. We saw fresh tracks. Ah, this is an alien, the duck species from the planet Duckula. Or my mascot. He comes on all our shoots. This is the UFO crash site in Aztec. It's also in the middle of nowhere, Hart Canyon Road. Again, if you didn't know to look for it, you wouldn't be able to find it. Now, because I'm a shameless self-promoter, we're going to play a portion of the tape now, the film Aztec 1948, where Scott and I are rummaging through parts of the crash site, and then I think Stan Friedman pops up. He's interviewed about the crash site as well. So if we can run that clip, and then unfortunately I'll be back for 10 minutes. All right, so you got a mystery road.
Yep.
You got a mystery slab. Roads allegedly cut by the military to come in here. Crane slabs allegedly put here to support, or the slabs allegedly put here to support a crane. The duck speaks. What's the crane recovering? Allegedly.
A flying disc, allegedly.
A flying disc. Now, where's the flying disc?
All right.
So you'd now be seeing a picture of us. Where was it back then? I will recreate that soon.
200 yards straight through.
Well, let's go take a look.
Works for me. Watch your footing.
Yeah. Got any snakes around here?
Not this time here.
The recovery group that was sent out to Aztec was a hybrid recovery that had been formed after the Roswell incident because the Roswell incident had been so badly botched with a news release. Basically, a lot of people at the base being aware of it, the newspaper running an article, and after the Roswell incident, this newly recovery group was formed.
This would have been a very, very elite group, so they would never have another Roswell incident where they had some young guys at a base, even though the 509th was a top-notch base with top-notch people. It was 8 months later, Roswell kind of got botched, the news release, the press release. And the old-timer I talked to that was in air intelligence said that we were dealing with a much more mature crowd back then, late 30s, early 40s. So they would never have the...
They'd never have another Roswell.
Yeah,
press releases going out, young PR officers and that sort of thing.
Right. This was one of the best recoveries they had done to date.
I think Aztec is certainly part of the cover-up. I think after Roswell, they got much better at covering things up, making sure that they monitored flights of vehicles so that they would get there first, remembering that New Mexico is not highly populated. I mean, today it's less than maybe 2 million people in the 5th largest state, mind you. I think that the government made it a strong policy. They set up MJ-12, and they put the clamps on. And part of the keeping secrets is to lie and misrepresent and misdirect. That's standard practice. You know, again, New Mexico, when the first atom bomb was exploded, July 16th, 1945, it was seen from 100 miles away. It was a pretty big bang. There were articles in the newspaper. Ammunition dump blows up. Nobody injured, fortunately. I've got some of those articles. They got good at covering things up.
Okay, thanks.
What we feel, based on all the reports, this would be the epicenter of the crash site right here. It was very...
Now that's a scary shot. So that's just a little excerpt from the film. Now if we can go back to the PowerPoint presentation, I'll just continue motoring along. Oh, geez, I don't want to look at myself. We're going to talk about a couple of witnesses that Scott has tracked down. Oh, there he is. Oh, this is the crash site again, out in the middle of nowhere. That's us. They have a plaque there. You can go sort of read it. Again, middle of nowhere. Right, witnesses, Ken Farley and Doug Nolan. Very quickly, you see 2 police officers there, or representations thereof. The whole controversy over the 2 police officers is, the story was that, that Scott had run into. He interviewed this guy named Ken Farley in 1999, I believe. And Ken was getting on in years and dying. And Ken said, look, I was there, I saw the crash saucer, a whole bunch of good details, but then he said to Scott, and there were 2 police officers at the crash site. And Scott said, well, that's all very interesting, but as he walked away, he thought, well, 2 police officers, you couldn't get 2 police officers up there now. I mean, no offense to the good law enforcement people of northern New Mexico, but if you call 911, you'd be hard-pressed to get 1 police officer out there in a speedy time. It's, again, in the middle of nowhere. Back then, 2, well, that seemed a little odd to Scott, so he put it in his gray basket. A couple years later, he interviewed another witness, Doug Nolan. And Doug told a very similar story to Ken Farley, including 2 police officers, 1 older, 1 younger. Turns out the younger one was from Cuba, New Mexico. The older one was the local law enforcement officer. But there you have, and in the legal world, this is something, you know, we love. 1 witness is good. If you have a witness that can back up what that witness just said, he doesn't know him, they've never met, Farley and Nolan had never met. Independent corroboration, that's important. And especially on a detail like 2 police officers when you wouldn't have expected to find 2 police officers at the crash site. So that, I mean, that's a really brief synopsis of it. But now I'm going to reveal the police officer. Oh no, I'm sorry, I lied. That's just me. But I really look good in my old Mountie uniform, so I just thought I'd throw that in. I had more hair back then and I was an awful lot thinner. Sorry. Last witness. Actually, you know, the good old days. Last witness, Robert Sarbacher. And I mentioned Dr. Sarbacher, who most of you probably know, for a couple of reasons. One, is a Canadian, it's always nice to throw a Canadian angle in. And Sarbacher came to light through the work of Wilbert Smith, Canadian government civil servant, who was interested in flying saucers and geomagnetics, which was his area of expertise, and tracked him down in the 1950s and asked him a few questions about the UFO phenomenon. And specifically, this is how it relates to Aztec. Wilbert Smith had read Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers. And he said, I have read Scully's book and would like to know how much is true. And Sarbacher said, the facts reported in the book are substantially correct. And Smith said, then the saucers do exist? And Sarbacher said, yes, they exist. So here's a government scientist from the United States telling a government scientist from Canada, hey, the facts in Scully's book, which by then had been largely discredited in the public eye, are substantially correct. And yes, the flying saucers do exist. He went on, because the Woods are great MJ-12 people. I'll briefly mention MJ-12, because I've also done a documentary on that, which is for sale downstairs, cheaply priced. Sarbacher continued, flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified matter in the United States, rated higher than the H-bomb. The modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush of Majestic 12 fame. And the entire matter is considered by the United States government to be of tremendous significance. And by the way, could you Canadians please keep your mouth shut? Which Wilbert Smith didn't, and it led to a whole bunch of trouble for Wilbert Smith. But we're troublesome people north of the border. We're not too keen on secrets. But the Pentagonians are. I love the good old days when they'd say things like the Pentagonians and the Saucerians. That kind of language we miss. I think ufology misses that today. There's a certain elegance to it. But here's Frank Scully in 1955. The Pentagonians have not given us the whole truth about the Saucerian mystery. Remember, again, this is after he'd been dragged through the mud as participating, or an unwilling participant in a hoax. It must be consoling to them to get a new crop each year to attempt to tear down the Scully bastion. Wow, I wonder if Stan has a bastion, the Friedman bastion. And thus continue to divide and rule. Last word. When I was doing my research into the Majestic 12 documentary, Do You Believe in Magic, I came upon, and I think ufologists often believe, because they live in a bit of an insular world where everybody knows most of the basic facts, that the rest of us out there know all those facts as well, like the Robertson panel, from the CIA's panel from 1952-53, that largely debunked the UFO phenomenon. Most people don't, in fact, know about that. They should, no matter what you think about the Robertson panel or what conclusions you would draw from it. But when you place it against what Scully's saying here, and against some of the things that come out when you're looking at Majestic 12, or Aztec, or Roswell, or anything, you can find this on the CIA's website, by the way. They're very obliging. The panel's concept, this is from the Robertson panel, the panel's concept of a broad educational program, because they thought, look, you know, we've got to educate the public. Now, people have always said they were educating the public because they wanted to cut down the number of reports, which were overloading the system, blah, 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 blah. That may be true, but I find this interesting. The panel's concept of this broad educational program, integrating efforts of all concerned agencies, was that it should have two major aims: training, okay, fair enough, and debunking. Well, that's pretty honest. The debunking aim would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media, such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles, the kind of articles that you'd find written in magazines like True. I'm just pointing that out. There's other things, incidentally, in the Robertson panel report where they talk about using amateur astronomers to spearhead the effort to debunk flying saucers in the public mind. What better person to head that effort than Dr. Donald Menzel, the nation's foremost astronomer? Things like that, little threads. Oh, hey, there's my film, which there's still a couple of copies downstairs. Interviews with Scott, Stan Friedman, Karl Pflock, Nick Redfern, Karl, because I believe in giving both sides of the argument equal time, and Rich Dolan, as well as footage of the crash site and the radar bases. Conclusion on Aztec: beyond a reasonable doubt, crash flying saucer? No, of course not. Still doubts. On the balance of probabilities? Maybe. But beyond a reasonable doubt to me is that there is meat on them there bones. This is a case that deserves to be put back in the first ranks of ufology, and it deserves to be investigated and analyzed more carefully and not just written off simply as a hoax, as it has been for 50 years. And hopefully my film, based on Scott's work, will help begin that process. Thank you very much.